If you're ever working with me and I hear you treat another colleague with disrespect, talk down to someone, I promise you I will fire you on the spot.
Coronavirus restrictions to be wound back in Brisbane as the area marks another day without local cases. Signs of improvement in the job market, with unemployment falling last month. And the country's southeast braces for high temperatures and fire danger as a heat wave approaches the region. Hello, welcome to ABC News. I'm Karina Carvalho. There's a new occupant in the White House, with Joe Biden officially sworn in as the 46th President of the United States. He was inaugurated at 4 o'clock this morning, Australian Eastern Daylight Time. It took place in front of a much smaller crowd than usual because of the pandemic and security concerns. Hordes of National Guard troops and American flags lined the National Mall, where people would usually gather. Kamala Harris was also sworn in as the country's first woman vice president. In attendance, former Vice President Mike Pence and former Presidents Bill Clinton, George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Donald Trump was notably absent. The inauguration included performances from Jennifer Lopez and Lady Gaga.
So proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming.
In his inaugural address, President Joe Biden said democracy had prevailed and vowed to unite a deeply divided country.
Democracy is precious. Democracy is fragile. And at this hour, my friends, democracy has prevailed. So now, on this hallowed ground where just a few days ago, violence sought to shake the Capitol's very foundation, we come together as one nation, under God, indivisible, to carry out the peaceful transfer of power as we have for more than 2 centuries.
Kamala Harris has made history as the first woman, Black and Asian American Vice President of the United States. Speaking in Washington, she paid tribute to those who came before her.
It is my honor to be here, to stand on the shoulders of those who came before, to speak tonight as your Vice President. In many ways, this moment embodies our character as a nation. It demonstrates who we are. Even in dark times, we not only dream, we do. We not only see what has been, we see what can be. We shoot for the moon, and then we plant our flag on it. We are bold, fearless, and ambitious. We are undaunted in our belief that we shall overcome, that we will rise up. This is American aspiration.
The former US President Donald Trump arrived in Florida after leaving the White House. The president didn't attend Joe Biden's inauguration, instead holding his own small ceremony at Andrews Air Force Base. Mr. Trump has lauded his administration's achievements and thanked the American people.
We've gotten so much done that nobody thought would be possible, but I do want to thank Congress, and I want to thank all of the great people of Washington, D.C., all of the people that we worked with to put this miracle together. So, have a good life. We will see you soon.
Well, for more, I'm joined by Tim Lynch, who's a professor in American politics at the University of Melbourne. Professor Tim Lynch, are you there? Are you ready to speak to us? Looks as though we might have lost the line with Professor Tim Lynch. We will come back to him and speak to him in a moment. Let's come back home and take a look at the Australian reaction. The Prime Minister and the opposition leader have joined world leaders in congratulating the new United States President Joe Biden. Noor Haider reports from Parliament House in Canberra.
Well, both the Prime Minister and the opposition leader have congratulated Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris on their inauguration. In doing so, the Prime Minister also acknowledged the significance of Kamala Harris becoming the Vice President, becoming the first woman to fill that role. Now, Scott Morrison also said that he looks forward to working with the Biden administration, and he named climate change as one of the issues that the two nations will have to work together to address, including and in addition to regional security in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, with respects to climate change, the Biden administration during the election campaign made the commitment to return to the Paris Agreement, as you just heard, and the president has already taken steps within his first day in office to move towards that. In addition to that, the Biden administration will commit to a net zero emissions target by 2050. That has been something that the Morrison government has been reluctant to adopt. Now, there have been calls for Australia to follow the United States or risk being an outlier in that regard. So we'll have to wait and see as to whether or not the Australian government will change its position in that regard. Here's a little bit of what Mr. Morrison had to say following the inauguration today.
I appreciate the sort of very warm sentiment that we're already getting back from the Biden administration and the many challenges that we have to work together on, both within our alliance, both more broadly in multilateral fora with like-minded countries, whether in the Quad, the G20, G7+, the OECD. There's a lot of work for us together, whether it's on climate, on energy, on international security, and importantly regional security here in the Indo-Pacific, and the great partnerships we have with the South Pacific nations, with the Southeast Asian nations and ASEAN. These are all the big issues that President Biden and I will continue to address together as Prime Ministers and Presidents always have.
Now, the opposition leader Anthony Albanese says today's inauguration represents a triumph of hope over fear. Mr. Albanese expressed confidence in President Biden's capacity to lead both domestically, but also to lead or to put the United States back in a position where it is a leader in a global sense. However, he did acknowledge that the president does have major tasks ahead of him at home.
Okay, let's take you back to our guest now, Professor Tim Lynch, who is an American politics professor at the University of Melbourne. Tim Lynch, I'm just checking that you can hear me clearly.
Karina, I can. I'm sorry about that technical issue.
Oh, no, that's great. It's great to have you on the line. So, Joe Biden, the new president, in his inauguration speech was talking about giving a message of unity, saying that democracy has prevailed. Are you hopeful or are you sceptical about what the new administration can achieve?
Well, I'm always hopeful. America is a nation that embodies a good deal of optimism. I think one of the central challenges that Biden faces is that because the fixation has been on Trump and not least the invasion of the Capitol by some of his supporters 2 weeks ago, it's taken the focus away from problems he faces within his own party. He is the president, of course, and he spoke a lot of diversity and unity and reconciliation. But he's got a party which is internally divided on so many of these issues. There's a very strong base represented by the forlorn-looking figure of Bernie Sanders this afternoon in Washington, who represents a far more radical wing than possibly Biden is prepared to accommodate. So once I think the anti-Trumpism has died down, the Democrats have been highly advantaged by having this wicked orange man to run against. Now he's left the scene. Some of the internal divisions within the Democratic Party itself are likely to resurface. So I think we'll be judging him not in terms of how far he refreshes from Donald Trump, how far he's able to detoxify, but how well he can actually run a party where he was, when he was given the nomination earlier last year, in the middle of last year, a nomination that was seen as a compromise pick by his party. So it's not all plain sailing for Biden.
Yeah, and there has been a real focus in his campaign, hasn't there, on identity politics. He picked a black woman who's also an Asian American in Kamala Harris as his running mate, and that created history today with her being inaugurated as vice president. And you see it also in his picks for his cabinet. So someone like Rachel Levine, who's a transgender doctor who will be his assistant health secretary. Is that the right move forward?
Well, I'm hardly going to argue that the diversity agenda is not the way to go, but I would observe that it's going to create some problems for him. One of the great difficulties that Democrats have had over the last 25 years is they've gradually moved away from a mostly white, alienated working class who see their jobs shipped to China. And if part of one of the central philosophies of his governing agenda is in some way to remain deaf to some of their concerns, then he faces a problem. Now, I think the diversity agenda in many ways represents an appropriate response given where Trump was at. But it's going to be easily caricatured as the Democrats being seized by a kind of campus woke left. And again, it speaks to that problem I highlighted earlier, that if that becomes the caricature, that this middle ground of voters that he needs to persuade over the course of his term become further distrustful, then that diversity agenda he's got becomes far more problematic. And I'd also, Karina, just observe that the notion of unity and reconciliation, of course, is a kind of boilerplate for every incoming American president. He's also got to find a good way of arguing that appointing people on the basis of race and gender represents unity rather than some of the problems of identity politics. So he's got a difficult set of issues raised by this, what's seen as a popular solution amongst his base. It's not plain sailing for Biden, I don't think.
What did you make of the optics of the inauguration? Even before the unrest at the Capitol 2 weeks ago, we knew that there wouldn't be an audience for this inauguration, that there'd be social distancing in place, masks would be worn. It's a very different look, isn't it, to inaugurations of the past?
Well, it does. Yes, absolutely, Karine. I think it plays up. Australia does trade on the fact that we've had such a low infection rate, and it's made us really, I think, blind to the extent of the crisis, the COVID crisis, as it's affected the United States. And this ceremony, which has been undertaken 59 times, installing 45 different men, has become such a basic, regularized symbol of American democracy that what the empty seats and the isolation play up is just how far COVID has affected not just ordinary people, but the actual body politic. So I think the actual ceremony itself was pretty dull. I don't think there's any great ringing phrases that will live long in the memory. But the optics of it, for sure, because they highlight the catastrophe that COVID has been in the United States, as we've not experienced it here in Australia.
And so now he begins the task of his really heavy agenda for his first 100 days, including having 100 million Americans vaccinated against COVID-19. Is it too ambitious a plan?
Well, in some ways, everything else, from climate change to identity politics to immigration, they're all secondary, tertiary issues when you're dealing with the death of 400,000 Americans, an enormous figure. It's almost incalculable outside of wartime. In fact, you've got to go back to the last great pandemic. The idea that there will be any other agenda issue that bests it would be an extremely hopeful claim. So what he does on COVID and what he's seen to be doing on COVID is going to make a huge difference to the leverage he then gets to exploit as a president that controls Congress. But that it's not just a matter of will, and it's not really a matter of ideology, as we're often told. This is a scientific, biological problem, and he faces an intractable federal system. We often forget, because we've become obsessed with our own federalism issue here, and how governors can go rogue. But in the US, that's a living, breathing part of the Constitution.
And that's where he's going to run into problems, say, with even something as simple as a national mask mandate, which he wants introduced.
Yes, he still, of course, does not control a majority of state houses. I mean, the Republicans have been not wiped out, but their power has been removed at a federal level. But there are states and state governors that will see a political interest in not doing what he mandates them to do on COVID, even now, after all these deaths. So it's important to remember that even this crisis, this health crisis, is refracted through partisan politics. It's not simply a technical issue, a technocratic issue. It's not just a matter of deferring to the science. The science is a matter for political and ideological division.
Yeah, and that's what we've seen play out over the last year in the United States, is that exactly what you said, that idea in Australia that we believe in the science. In the United States, it's a political issue. There are people who don't believe in masks, and they're saying that his plan to set up 100 federal vaccination centres, his critics are saying that, you know, that's about campaigning and not about a health priority.
Yes, I mean, I agree with that. There is a misplaced notion, you get it in the US, but certainly get it outside it, that the president is the most consequential figure, and in some ways he is, but that doesn't mean that at the click of his fingers, he can get 50 different states with different sets of interests to do what he wants. He has to bargain. Any great president is a negotiator. This is what Trump was pretty useless at, which is why he ended up losing the presidency and losing both houses of Congress. Biden's whole shtick for the last 50 years is that he knows how to work across the aisle. He's a deal cutter. He's ideologically mobile. Now, he's got to be able to do that to deal with some of the intractable problems caused by COVID without losing his ideologically committed base. So I keep coming back to the notion that he faces a challenge. He's got a media and an academy and an international community that seems very keen for him to succeed. That's not enough to be a great president. To be a great president, you've got to know how to negotiate and appease those who have a vested interest in your political demise. So he's got a tough ask, and he's doing it as the oldest man ever elected to the job.
You mentioned the media, the mainstream media reporting on Joe Biden. I wanted to ask you about that because Jen Psaki, his press secretary, was lauded today for simply answering questions. How do you think the media is going to go about reporting the Joe Biden presidency versus the Trump presidency?
Well, he will enjoy a considerable honeymoon, but I think even journalists, despite their leftward tinge, are going to be looking for stories, and the smell of failure is going to be much more compelling. It's a competitive system, and holding power, even though the mainstream media supports you, is not a guarantee of success. In fact, one could say the expectations are so high on Biden, they weren't on Trump. Everyone expected Trump to lose, and he largely did, certainly in terms of COVID. With Biden, he's got much further to fall because there are so many vested interests amongst the elites on university campuses that expect him to succeed, to be their voice. And as a process of governing, he's unable to fulfill that. Of course, you will expect a good deal of disillusionment to set in.
Professor Tim Lynch, it was great that we could eventually get you on the line. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.
Well, for more on the inauguration, we'll be playing US President Joe Biden's speech along with coverage from our Foreign Affairs analyst Stan Grant at 8:30 Eastern Daylight Time. And you can catch up on all the highlights from today's inauguration on ABC iView. A search is underway after reports of children being washed